Hi, everybody. We're just getting ready to get started with today's lecture. I hope you're all doing okay. And I'm just testing very quickly that you can hear me and see me all good. If you can, please just let me know in the chat. And well, we will be starting in exactly, according to my phone, 4 minutes and a half. So don't worry, we're here early. And if you're watching us from YouTube, hello there. Thank you so much for joining us over there on that side of the internet. So I'm just gonna quickly check that everything is running okay on my end of things. But like I said, if you could just give me a thumbs up or something to let me know that you can hear me and see me all fine, or just leave a message in the chat, that would be super good, just so I know that that is all sorted. And I'm just gonna check that my PowerPoint is all fine because my hard drive did something funny when I connected it. So I just want to make sure that I've not lost anything all of a sudden. So there we go. Thanks so much, guys. Hi, Steve. How are you doing? Welcome, Leighton. Hi, Linda. Thank you so much. Hi, Amy. Thanks for being here, guys. Hope you're all doing really good. Happy Monday. Hope that this week is treating you very well and that you had a lovely weekend. And I really hope that you're somewhere in the world where spring has actually arrived, because here in the UK, in Southampton today, we are at 9 degrees, which is not spring, everybody. It's very cold in here still. So I really hope you're having better luck with the weather than we are. Well, just to let you know, we have approximately 3 minutes until we get started with the lecture today. You're all very welcome to leave any messages in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're joining from, how do you feel about the revival session today, or what's your interest in the subject? And then we will be getting rolling very, very soon. Hi, Linda. Thank you so much. How are you doing? Hope everything is going well. And yes, Peter, I know it's been nasty, hasn't it? We are not complaining just because we're in Britain. It genuinely has been nasty, I swear. Hi, Patricia. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope you're having a good day too. But yes, it's been it's been a very interesting spring. How 14 in Halifax? Okay, well, and that's not too bad, right? I don't know anymore. Steve, I was at Cali. Oh my God. Yeah, I don't know how you did that, Steve. That requires a degree of commitment that only a true fan really could have, gotten themselves through. I hope that the match was worth it, essentially. Hi, Dominic. How are you doing? Thank you so much for joining. Lovely to see you. And good. I'm glad that Memphis is ready because we're not. Oh, no worries. It's my absolute pleasure, Patricia. Thank you so much for being here. We're just raring to go and getting started with some more art history. And yeah, it's been so much fun doing these classes today. Again, I kind of got a bit overexcited when I was preparing my PowerPoint for today, and it's a little bit of lots of images from everywhere. I really hope that today's session kind of razzle dazzles you, because I've been a little bit cheeky and actually introduced some content that is not European, but that's okay. Hi, Michelle. Welcome, Adriana. How are you doing, Marty? Thank you so much for joining us here. Oh, 80s in Tennessee. Well, I'm glad that it is spring like somewhere at least. Enjoy it, Marty. Enjoy it for us and send the sun over this way, because I think in Europe we have a cold front just coming in, which is like, why we're so cool. Bonjour, Bruno. Comment ça va? Merci beaucoup. Hi from Wirral. Hope you're doing very good over there. And well, we are almost about to get started, guys. We have literally less than a minute to get going. So we will be rolling very soon. And for those of you just arriving to the session, thank you so much for joining us. You're welcome to introduce yourselves in the chat before we get started, because remember that during the actual talk itself, the chat will remain close, at least for a little while. Hi, Lucia. Thank you so much for being back. And I'm glad that you're looking forward to today's session. Hi, Sonia. How is Cape Town treating you? Hi from Paris. Lovely having you here. Jacob, do you personally believe that Robin Hood was a real person? Well, Jacob, to be honest, all legends are based on something that is at least partially truth. So I think there might have been most likely, if not one person, a group of people that inspired the legend of Robin Hood. Who those people may have been, that's a different story. But that is where I stand on that. And well, I believe it's time to get started, guys. So I'm just gonna do a very quick introduction. So hello, everybody. Welcome to our session today. My name is Dr. Lilian Céspedes González. And in case you know me, call me Lily. If you don't know me, Lily is fine too. I know I have a very long name. And well, it's doctor because I have a PhD in history from the University of Winchester here in the UK. And today we are doing the third session, which should technically be the fourth session, and I'll explain that in a second, about our academy on the art and architecture of the Middle Ages. So I'll be starting to share the slideshow in a moment. Hi, Marja. Thank you so much for joining us again. But before I do that, I will be just sharing now in the chat the ways in which you can keep on contributing to the way that we bring these talks, lectures, and academies to you over here in World Virtual Tours. As you know, everything that we do here, the project itself, is funded through the donations that you can do through PayPal and Stripe. The links are in there just now for you. If at any point you have problems with the links, just give us a quick buzz and we will sort it out for you briefly. And remember that you also have in there the link to the upcoming tours for the rest of the month. And just to do a very quick recap, if you're joining my tour on Saturday at 8 p.m., so exactly at the same time that we're doing this now, we will be going to the beautiful town of Salisbury, where as well as seeing Salisbury, we will be having a video of just Salisbury Cathedral. So for those of you who were enjoying Gothic last week, I really hope that you can make it because it's truly a lovely place. Well, the chat is now officially closed, but do not worry. If you have any questions, I'll be able to answer them at the end of the talk. And well, for now, let's get started, essentially. Let me just bring up my PowerPoint and let's buckle up for our session on revivals. And I'll explain why we're doing revivals today instead of, the one that we have missing, which is Romanesque. So this is the topic for today, and this has been the structure of the course. So the first session that we had was before Romanesque. Then, unfortunately, I was ill on our second week, and that's why the Romanesque session has been rescheduled for the week after this one, which will be the last one. We didn't want to affect the timetable because some people couldn't make all the sessions, and we didn't want to, mess about the bookings that already were. So that's why we're doing it this way. Last week was Gothic. Remember that you can still access the lecture on Gothic pre-recorded through the World Virtual Tours site, and you have the link in the chat as well. And today we're going to be talking about revivals. Now, you also have in there on the screen my email. If at any point you have any questions regarding any of these topics or for the quiz or anything else, you're always very welcome to contact me. No problem at all. And well, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's talk about revival. So why is revival architecture a thing, right? Where does it come from? Well, revival architecture is actually a very important aspect of how the 19th century essentially develops. It's not just exclusive to the 19th century, but it's the moment when it's going to be at its peak and when we see it really taking shape and being, truly important from that regards. Now, the point of revival architecture is essentially to weaponize the power that buildings have to present the glory of a nation. As you see, everything in history always has some kind of political, cultural, or social agenda. And the reason why in the 19th century this is very important is because this is the moment when we see movements like Romanticism and nationalism being on the rise. Well, as a result, many countries around Europe and the world, but since we are kind of focusing mostly on Europe this time, they were looking to establish their supremacy, to almost like establishing their PR for marketing about what they are all about. particularly because if you think about it, a lot of nations around the world are truly consolidating not just their power, but their borders throughout the 19th century. So in a way, architecture is domination of the landscape, is sending messages to their people, but also to potential foreigners. And it's, like I said, just propaganda. But overall, it's just a visual medium that everybody understands. So it's the way we communicate messages, right? We're visual creatures, we humans. So that's why we do it this way. Well, all of this is good and great, but of course, there is more context to it than just, oh, it's just the 19th century and everybody has an agenda. Well, by this moment in time, of course, humans have been around the block for quite some time. And, we start being curious about our own history and about our own past. And we are developing new ways to engage with it, partially because of romanticism and nationalism. We're doing a lot of revisionist work on our own past. A lot of the great academic institutions are coming through properly at this moment in time. So we are starting to see a movement called historicism. And historicism really starts at the end of the 18th century on the backtail of Enlightenment. And essentially, it focuses on artistic styles that take inspiration from history for the purpose of recreating them. Now, this is not just exclusive to architecture, it applies to many different forms of art. But the main purpose here and the reason why it becomes very important is due to the increasing work in conservation. Now, I'm sure you realize that by the 19th century, it's been at least 400 years plus to the Middle Ages. And of course, there is a lot of heritage that is starting to fall apart, not just from the Middle Ages, but of course, from many different periods in history. And we're starting to become aware of the fact that, well, some of our buildings need maintenance. And what is the right way of taking care of those buildings, or in general, taking care of our history, right? Because since we are now concerned with our national narratives, we have this new appreciation for our material culture. Well, as a result, with this conservation work, we start looking for ways to mimic mostly and recreate what artisans in the past have been doing, so that when we do it ourselves, you almost cannot see the difference between new and old. So that's kind of where it comes from. And overall, this general idea of revivals, it's not just something that, like I said, is applicable to the Middle Ages. There are going to be, throughout the 19th century, revivals about all kinds of history and all kinds of architectural styles. But of course, what concerns us today is the Middle Ages only. Now, in terms of the lecture today, we're mostly going to be focusing on architecture for one reason. Revival from the point of view of other arts doesn't happen at the same speed or with the same intensity. So while in other sessions we've explored things like sculpture or painting, it just doesn't have the exact same holding. And that's because from the point of view of the plastic arts, Europe is going into a completely different pathway. The new modern criterias are a little bit different. It is true that there are going to be some schools of thought, like, for example, the pre-Raphaelites in England, that will use the topic of medievalism and romanticism to push forward those, older aesthetics. But for the, most part, we are diverging into different ways rather than rediscovering what we already know. So that is why today we're mostly focusing on architecture. And well, just so you can get things started and understand a bit more about what these revivals mean, you see here the beautiful example of the Uspenki Cathedral in Helsinki. So as you see, I'm sure you were not expecting me to use, things like Helsinki in here today. Well, I didn't want to be obvious, particularly not today when we're talking about revival. So I'm actually putting examples from many different parts of the globe so you can really understand the impact that this whole movement had, because it really went far beyond the borders of the geographical areas that we've explored even, in these last few weeks. So let's start with the first revival that pertains us, which is Neo-Byzantine or Byzantine Revival. So just so you know, if you see neo whatever or whatever revival, it's the exact same way. It's just different academic, pathways prefer one thing or the other. But it essentially means new something or another, which is what we're talking about. Well, you may recall from our first lecture that, of course, Byzantine art was very important, likewise with architecture. And this is going to come back to Europe. In some ways, Byzantine art and architecture never really left because, of course, the impact of Byzantium through Constantinople and many of the other countries that took part in that huge empire always had a residue. But, well, with the different changes in Europe after the 15th century, it had fallen a little bit to the background. But in the 19th century, it's going to come back strong again. Now, in Western Europe, we will see Neo-Byzantine style, mostly from the 1840s onwards. But it had already started much earlier in Russia with the reigns of Nicholas I and Alexander II. And by the way, guys, if you want to have a better look at this kind of architecture and the reign of these two people, remember that my colleague Anna has a tour with us here in World Virtual Tours at the beginning of May, where you will actually explore some of these subjects a bit more focused. So do go and check it out. Well, why does this happen in Russia first? Because at this moment in time, Russia has a huge empire, and in many ways, their architecture is a way of expanding the Orthodox agenda in the empire itself. So we're going to see this trend rising up all throughout the 19th century up until 1917, when, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution changes many things, and architecture is going to be one of them. However, although Russia finds a hold in that development of Neo-Byzantine architecture, there are going to be other European countries that will continue that. But before I get to that, the main feature that we see in most of these new Byzantine buildings is that the material that they are using to construct them has changed. Instead of using a lot of stone or a lot of brick, now we're seeing concrete. And, reinforced concrete, to be precise. And why is that? Well, I'm sure you can understand, even from our modern perspective, it's much faster to build something out of concrete. It tends to stay pretty solid for a long time. So it's just a way of speeding up the process of these huge buildings. And, at the end of the day, particularly from the point of view of Byzantine art and architecture, everything ends up being painted over regardless. So it doesn't really matter what is lying underneath if you're just going to apply, paint over it. So that's why they do that change. And of course, concrete also means that the costs are a little bit lower, which helps in that sense. Well, a good example of this type of revival architecture is the Kronstadt Naval Cathedral that you have here. But like I said, some of the best examples actually of Byzantine revival are not even gonna come out of Russia in Europe. They're gonna come from other places in the Balkans, believe it or not. And one of the most renowned elements is actually this beautiful cathedral that you have here, Alexander Nevsky in Bulgaria. I've had the absolute honor and pleasure to visit this cathedral in the flesh. It's gorgeous in and out. If you have the chance to go, Sofia is a city that is very, underrated, 100% worth every single aspect of the trip. Well, Bulgaria is going to keep on using Neo-Byzantine architecture, not on its own, always utilizing traditional Bulgarian, architectural styles mixed in there. And that is actually what's going to allow Bulgaria to have a very interesting turn of the century architecture, because this Neo-Byzantine style that you see here in the cathedral will later on inform as well their Art Nouveau and their modernist tendencies. But this is a very well-known example. The cathedral itself is huge. And even inside, you can see the new wave of Byzantine paintings, which are incredible. Well, but funnily enough, the most famous country, for the sake of, preserving Neo-Byzantine style, and that has done so until actually a lot more recently, is Serbia. A lot of people don't expect this, but in Serbia, there was a huge amount of resistance towards influences from the West, particularly in the 19th and in 20th century. There was always a lot of kinship between Russia and Serbia. That's indeed, in part, how the First World War ends up being a little bit tricky. And well, in Serbia, this type of art style is not just going to be used for Orthodox churches or any kind of religious building. It's also often going to be used for secular buildings. And in fact, perhaps the most famous building in this architectural style is unfortunately a building that does not exist anymore, which is the old post office of Belgrade. This is a postcard from back in the day when the building was still standing. I'm sure you can see it's a massive building, incredibly iconic and absolutely gorgeous. Back in the day, it was definitely the height of Serbian architecture, but unfortunately, it was destroyed during the Second World War. And although it was rebuilt in 1947, there were a lot of controversies as to whether the revival was truly worth it. There were, a lot of issues from a political perspective, because from the new communist regime, this was perceived to be too bourgeois and too flashy. So, yeah, the reconstruction didn't quite work out. And actually, in 2023, the new building of the old post office got pretty much demolished for new changes. So that's why we're using a postcard from the past, because unfortunately this beauty does not exist anymore. Well, this type of architectural style in Serbia is actually going to continue all throughout the 19th century until the Second World War, where it stops. And with the arrival of communism, it will sort of disappear. However, it will actually come back again for a short while after the fall of what used to be old Yugoslavia, as a way of exploring its own past and regaining its identity as a sovereign nation. Serbia made a lot of use of Serbian Byzantine style to promote new buildings. Unfortunately, just not the post office, which is a real shame, but sometimes these things happen. Well, now that we've seen the revival of Byzantine, let's go to Neo-Romanesque. So, I appreciate we're doing our Romanesque session next week, but imagine that we've gone through this already. Well, Romanesque seems to start in Britain, which is perhaps no surprising, because as we were going to see next week, it's going to be in Britain where we see some great examples of Romanesque architecture. And indeed, it starts happening in the 18th century because, once again, restoration work. A lot of the buildings, castles, churches that we had in the country, particularly the Tower of London and Windsor Palace, which are, of course, very iconic buildings, needed repairs. And that kickstarts this new tendency of building in Romanesque style. Well, this is how it's going to start cropping up. However, Romanesque is not going to be as popular in terms of its new revival in many ways. And, well, that's because of a few other things that are happening in Britain and in a few other countries at this moment in time. Romanesque does have a tendency towards classical lines, and between Byzantine and Neoclassicism, which is occurring in other parts of Europe, it sort of falls a little bit through the cracks. But it will be used mostly for some religious buildings. However, religious buildings of what we call low order. And what does that mean? Well, it essentially means buildings that are from smaller churches, particularly congregations, which at this moment in time belong often to either non-conforming Christianity or even dissenting orders of Christianity. And we will see why that is in just a moment when we revisit Gothic. However, there is going to be a country not in Europe where Romanesque is going to make it big, and that is where we're crossing over the Atlantic, the United States of America. This is the Trinity Church in Boston, which is a beautiful building and a very good example of Romanesque. And not just Romanesque. This building actually picks up on a specific architectural style within Romanesque that will be developed in the US. Now, why does Romanesque become really popular in the US? Well, in the 1840s, a lot of migrants from Germany start arriving, and Romanesque, as we will see next week, was very important for the development of Germany during the Middle Ages. So, with the nation making and the holding up to heritage, the migration is going to help making that popular style. And well, in the US, there is going to be a tendency of building a lot with brick. And Romanesque brick buildings are massive, they are very imposing, and the sort of brutal aesthetic is really going to be something quite appealing. So it just makes sense. Aside from in churches, we often see Romanesque buildings in the US and in Europe in different settings. Often things that may surprise you, like commercial buildings and even warehouses. So, from the point of view of industry, once again, we're building a lot in brick. Brick is a very kind of practical type of material. So, in many ways, commercial spaces don't require perhaps as much light, but they require a lot of strong structure. And that is exactly what Neo-Romanesque is giving you, proper solid buildings, which is why, well, Gothic will then take over the most religious, heavy lifting. But like I was saying, this is a very good example of a specific style of Romanesque, which is Richardsonian. This is actually developed by Harry Hobson Richardson. And this architect is actually gonna use different styles of Romanesque throughout Europe. He's gonna mix them all together and create like a melting pot of different versions of Romanesque. And it will actually become very influential for architects that will come later. And the key idea behind Richardsonian Romanesque is the structure of the round arch, which you see very well here at Trinity Church, alongside with what we call rustication, which comes from the word rustic. And I'm sure you can notice that in the building, on top of different shapes of brick, we see a lot of stone that seems kind of chiseled a bit rough. Well, by giving the stone that look, it makes it look a bit more rugged, a little bit like it's countryside and, quirky, interesting, with a lot of texture, which makes perfect change and dynamism alongside with the brick. But out of all of the buildings that exist in the United States and all the examples that we have of New Romanesque in the world, one of the most famous and perhaps one of the best ones is, of course, the Smithsonian Building in Washington, D.C. Because if you look at this, it's kind of the perfect combination of a castle and a church all together from the Middle Ages. Now, I'm cheating a little bit because the Smithsonian Building actually combines some Gothic elements. And if you have keen eyes, you may see that some of those windows have actually trefoil arches. But that is because by the time this kind of architecture comes to the US, the revivals are all kind of starting to mingle together. However, overall, this is comparable to churches that we see throughout England, France, Spain in the 11th century, easy. And again, as you see, the brick give it that's kind of, indestructible look, which is what really gives us the great appeal. Well, we're now gonna flip over to Gothic. I am gonna grab a sip of water because I'm very thirsty. So let me rehydrate. And since we are here probably halfway through the tour, I'm also gonna drop in the chat the ways in which you can keep on allowing World Virtual Tours to organize these sessions. You have in there the links for the donations through PayPal and Stripe that keep the Academy and all of our tours going, of course. And you also have in there the link to the upcoming tours. So remember, for Salisbury, I'll be seeing you on Saturday. Well, Neo-Gothic. Now, Neo-Gothic is going to take, admittedly, a big chunk of this lecture because we kind of go crazy for it everywhere in the world, which is funny because if you remember last week, right, we were talking about how very quickly after it was a thing, everybody was like, oh, no, Gothic is so ugly. We don't care about it. So we humans obviously don't know what we want until we want it again. Well, in the Western world, Neo-Gothic is going to become the highlight, really, of 19th century architecture. And once again, it seems to spark in England, although we have some controversies, I'll explain in a moment, because of the rise of evangelic movements, and Anglo-Catholicism. And I've just thrown a lot of words in there, so let me explain. Now, as you may know, England is a very complicated country in terms of religion. And we will explore some of these, by the way, in a couple of months' time when we have my new academy on the history of England up to Tudor times. Well, since the time of the Reformation in the 16th century, England had been flip-flopping between Catholicism, the Reformed Church, different versions of the Reformed Church, etc., etc. And it is at the end of the 19th century, particularly in certain areas where, well, big important Gothic buildings like Oxford had always had a strong impact, where evangelical ideas start cropping up again, and the desire to go back to an Anglo-Catholic church rather than just Anglican, which is Reformed Church. So throughout the end of the 18th century and the 19th century, these ideas are going to be on the rise, and architecture, of course, is going to follow, because it always does. It's the way we express our thoughts. So why? Why do we do this? Because we want to emphasize as a nation here in the UK some of the links that we had to our own religion before the Reformation, because ever since then, our architecture in the UK has been quite low key. We've never really had something that was properly, stereotypically ours in terms of identity. And we need to build a very strong image because of the empire. So as you see, once again, it's all political PR. Well, another reason, of course, is the fact that medievalism at this moment in time is on the rise, and medievalism is going to also be influenced by the antiquarian movement, which rises a lot in the UK. This is the moment when we're going to see a lot of archaeologists, historians, philanthropists going all across the world, digging up parts of our past and being like, this is quite cool. What do we do with this now? Where do we preserve it? How do we take care of it? So those two things go, hand in hand together. Trying to figure out how to take care of our things better is going to push us to express ourselves differently according to the ancients. And well, there is another very important aspect. Gothic, at this moment in time, particularly from the point of view of the UK, is associated with traditional values. Why? Because if you remember, right at the end of the 18th century, something quite important happens in France, the traditional enemy of the Brits, the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, as France has mostly been doing now for about 200 years, uses classical style to promote their libertarian ideas and republican ideas. So, God forbid that the British monarchy would allow such revolutionary thoughts into their own country. So, Gothic is associated with the strong identity of the feudal monarchies in the Middle Ages, which suits the empire, and in general, conservative values that are promoted by Victorian society. So it's perfect. It's like, jelly and butter in this case. So that's why it comes through. Now, at the same time, it's quite interesting because Gothic in the UK had sort of survived, or more than survived, lingered for a lot longer than in other places in Europe, all the way up to the 17th century. And we see buildings, particularly in university towns like Oxford and Cambridge, that although already quite late in Gothic, they still hold a lot of those elements. So it's almost like we never quite wanted to let go, and we just kept on using it for quite some time. Because I guess, if it works, why invent something new? Well, at the same time, with so much Gothic architecture in the UK, there are going to be lots of restorations. So you see how everything comes together. Political agenda, conservation, heritage, aesthetics. It's all perfect. And that is why, well, it starts coming through. And then there is going to be something quite peculiar that happens. During this time period, we're also going to see the rise of literature. And, Gothic literature has a way of being called Gothic because of something we're going to realize in a moment. Now, at this moment, a very famous French author called Victor Hugo is going to release his novel of The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris is considered one of the most famous examples of Gothic architecture. So the book, in a way, also raises up hype in all of Europe about this type of architecture. So if you see, many different countries start having different elements of their own cultures that pushes in that direction. And well, not just that, there is going to be a very important building, which is this beautiful cathedral, which is the Cathedral of Cologne, which just is going to be finished. Now, the Cathedral of Cologne was actually started to be built in 1248 in the middle of actual Gothic. But as you see, it's a mammoth of a building. It's massive. And by the 19th century, it was still in the process of being completed. Now, for the sake of keeping structural integrity, Neo-Gothic obviously was very convenient. So Cologne architecture is a very interesting example because it's often very difficult to know where the new and the old Gothic are. And this is once again what pushes a lot of those conservation, historicism kind of works to create a seamless blend between new and old to keep the past alive. Well, throughout this whole process, we encounter strong tints of nationalism and romanticism all across Europe, utilizing this aesthetic for, our own different uses. So this is the moment where we encounter a quite a strange phenomenon, which is the fact that both England, France, and Germany all claim they are the birth nation of Gothic revival. It's entirely up to you to decide which one has it. I'm not going to argue it because even amongst ourselves, even amongst art historians, it's difficult for us to really come to a rational conclusion. We can accept normally, generally speaking, that in England, it happens, at a very all-encompassing speed that ticks all the boxes. But indeed, there were efforts that combined Gothic elements early on in Germany and in France, and they cannot be completely disaside. So, well, this causes a little bit of a ruckus in that regards. Well, what we see towards these later stages, though, of Gothic revival is that new elements start being introduced, like, for example, ironwork. And ironwork becomes very popular in Spain through the work of Gaudí. And well, I say Spain, specifically in Catalonia, because Gaudí, as maybe some of you would know from the other lectures some of my colleagues organize here in World Virtual Tours, Gaudí is going to be a Spanish Catalan genius who is going to push really the edges of art at this moment in time. And although ironworks in Gothic are being used everywhere, this is the kind of excellence that Gaudí creates at Park Güell, the entrance towards the pavilions. This is what you see there, this kind of dragon, which is really mesmerizing. And once again, medievalism, because it's borrowing from that almost idea of fantasy, of the unknown and escapism to embellish new type of buildings. And that's also the reason why we're going to see a lot of Gothic elements in Art Nouveau in the generations to come. Gaudí and the Sagrada Familia are another example of one of those cathedrals that started being built in Neo-Gothic and it's still, to be finished. So, there are lots of things happening at this moment in time. But the final thing that is crucial for Neo-Gothic is the fact that we become obsessed with decoration. And somebody tell me, does not want this as their library. I am enamored with the study for Sir Walter Scott here, because again, this whole ideology of romanticism and the use of so much decoration around our internal design is going to borrow a lot from churches and from palaces and castles, which were rich in decoration, but for all kinds of buildings. And that is where we start seeing our obsession with tracery windows and all kinds of nitty-gritty decor that will really start elevating it to a whole new level. This is how Neo-Gothic starts shaping Europe. But it doesn't end there, because there are going to be some new tendencies that Neo-Gothic will really use to push the envelope. Now, something quite major that happens in Europe at this moment in time in the 19th century, and not just Europe, but more, I guess, present in Europe due to our space issues. In the US, there is a lot of land, so it's not necessarily applicable in the same way, is that we start developing major metropolitan cemeteries. And well, our obsession now with life after death is going to push the limits of creativity once again. So Gothic will be applied, as you can see here, in the necropolis of Glasgow, which, by the way, the photo doesn't do it any justice. It's a beautiful cemetery, a bit creepy, but really beautiful. All this Gothic is going to come through in chapels, in entrances to the cemeteries themselves, and of course, in a lot of the funerary tombs that we start encountering. And it will become super popular because it's quite expressive and rich. And that is in some ways why the Gothic style of writing, while Gothic literature is often so closely linked to the horror and supernatural. Because if you think about it, churches, ruins, and cemeteries is all you need to build a good Gothic piece of, writing. So you see how all of these things start intermingling together and why it becomes such a powerful move. You cannot really detach one without having the other to understand the impact that it has throughout the whole world. Well, on the other hand, elsewhere in the world, we're going to see how Gothic starts shaping specific areas. And in the US specifically, we're going to see particularly the use of Gothic in what we call collegiate architecture. So the architecture of educational institutions such as colleges and universities. And a very good example that you have here is from Cornell Uni. That kind of tracery, but with brick and with different ways of creating those vaultings, becomes almost the bread and butter of most important unis in the United States. But where does the inspiration come from? Well, once again, the old colonies, specifically Oxford. There is going to be one important construction company, I think it's called the Cope and Stewardson company, that will be given a lot of these college projects. And the leaders of this organization will go to England to get inspiration from, some of the older institutions. Of course, Oxford and Cambridge, in their majority, are done in the original Gothic. So that's what's going to inspire a lot of these institutions to move in this style. But Gothic mutates a lot throughout the world. And it is particularly in places that are either still part of the British Empire or ex-colonies where we see many iterations. So, for example, look at the beautiful example we have here of the Library of Parliament in Canada. I didn't forget about you, my dear Canadians. This is a wonderful building which is comparable to many basilicas and many churches we have all across Europe. Then this is, of course, Gothic revival at its finest in Melbourne, St. Patrick. It's the cathedral over there. That spire is something worthy of what we're going to be seeing in Salisbury on Saturday. So as you see, I guess the pushing of the agendas, English, new or old, kind of gets everywhere in many ways. And then things start changing. This is the beautiful church of All St. Paul's in Wellington, in New Zealand. And as you see, this is a very different type of Gothic. It's not something that we can easily identify with its origins in the Middle Ages, but it has a lot of elements like those traceries, the pointed arches, and the use of wood for decoration. And here we have something completely different. This is perhaps one of the most amazing examples of revival architecture that involves Gothic and the Middle Ages in the whole world. This is, by the way, a UNESCO site, and it used to be called the old Victoria Terminal Station in Mumbai. As you see, this is a mix of Gothic elements, Indian traditional elements, particularly from the Mughal period, and some details of Romanesque, because like I said, by this moment in time, a lot of things are just, being utilized whatever way we can. What cannot be denied is that, like with Gothic everywhere, this is a feast for the eyes. And this is, of course, once again, the remnants of what the British Raj left in India. So I'm sure you were not expecting to see Gothic as far away as places like Mumbai, and yet it happens. It's not just in places that have connections to the UK. Many other colonial residues will develop this way. A lot of churches in Latin America coming down through the Spanish route are gonna have beautiful Gothic cathedrals left, right, and center, and likewise in a few vestiges of the French Empire. But it's really something that endures for such a long time. The decline of Neo-Gothic is not gonna come until the 1930s, from the beginning of the 19th century. We're talking of over a millennium. And the reason for that is very simple. By that moment in time, new materials are becoming more and more readily available, like steel and glass. So building in stone and in brick starts becoming a little bit unnecessary. And not just that, Europe is changing, the United States are changing, everywhere is changing. The modern world requires modern aesthetics for man to enjoy. We cannot be trapped in the past if we're looking ahead in the future. And by this moment in time, we've already endured a very nasty First World War, so we need to freshen up, essentially. That's why Gothic kind of needs to die out. Now, there are gonna be several cathedrals normally that were built right at the beginning of the 20th century and that will not be completed once again due to their sheer size until later on in the 20th century. But it's not because the art style was still loved or popular, it's just because, they take an awful amount of time to be done. Well, and you'll be thinking, okay, that's all revivals done, right, Lily? No, I have one more surprise for you. Because you may remember that in our first lecture, we talk a lot about the impact of Islamic art in Europe and the fact that there were many countries all across Europe in the Middle Ages where Islamic art was important. Well, we have here two examples from polar opposite ends of Europe, one of which perhaps may come as a surprise. Here on the left, you have one of the beautiful pavilions from the Expo in Seville, which some of you have seen in one of the tours that I did last summer, I believe, here in World Virtual Tours. It's no surprises that in countries like Spain, with the legacy of Al-Andalus, we encounter a revival of Islamic art. Now, this type of architecture is a little bit touch and go currently because, like with many things that are part of the Islamic background of Spain, it still uses words that are not truthful to its development. We call this neo-mudéjar, new mudéjar. And you may recall either from the Golden Age or maybe even from our lecture a few weeks ago that we are trying to move away from using this word mudéjar because it implies that it belongs to a culture that is not necessarily European, when in fact it is. Islam was part of Spain, it was part of Italy, it was part of the Balkans. It is European art, and it doesn't require to be named as something else. So one thing that I hope you take away from this is that mudéjar, or Moorish, as we call it often in English, is actually not just the wrong way of framing this type of art style. It rejects the truth about our past, and even for many people that are Islamic and Muslim, it's considered quite seriously despective because it's not terribly inclusive and it's not truthful to the representation of our art and our history. Well, in any case, what you see here is beautiful work in tiles once again. The use of that horseshoe archway, which is what we call that kind of narrow thing at the bottom with the round at the top, and the use of color, which is again a very popular type of technique in Islam, alongside with arabesque, which is the writing of very complicated patterns that creates all of those beautiful intricacies that informed, of course, all styles like Gothic and Neo-Gothic later. And you'll be thinking, all right, so that is in Spain. What is here on the right? Well, believe it or not, that is the National and University Library of Bosnia-Herzegovina, because it may come as a surprise, but as of 1878, Bosnia became part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, in another attempt of, political propaganda and keeping everybody happy, the empire became very aware that Bosniak population were Muslim. And in fact, Bosnia-Herzegovina is still, half of the country is still Muslim, and then the other half is divided between Catholicism and Orthodox religion. So how could they, at least from an appearance kind of sake, keep up that legacy by utilizing references from Al-Andalus and Neo-Mudéjar, as well as Mamluk architecture from Egypt and Syria to promote this kind of new Islamic architecture revival. Once again, with the same patterns, a lot of color, the arches, and structures that tend to be quite clean and strikingly, impressive from the point of view of not just architecture, but sculpture and painting, which is something that Islam has always done together in one, big sort of development of art. So, as you see, it's not just as simple as Romanesque or Gothic. There are a lot of things going on in the 19th century in terms of revivals, but a lot of other medieval art styles that will keep on informing our modern tastes. Of course, elsewhere outside of Europe, a lot of these art styles have developed and have been developing for a long time. But the fact that they keep on coming back in fashion, in a way, I guess, is what, makes us often think, what is it that attracts us to other periods of time? Is it just the aesthetic? Of course. But in many ways, it's the way that we are using those aspects of our history to inform the present and to some extent, manipulate the way we want to present ourselves to the world as a society. Well, before we open up the chat for questions, I wanted to bring up some further reading to your attention. So for those of you wanting to really dive deep into Gothic revival architecture, the title by York is very extensive. It's a very thick book where you will explore Gothic revival in all its shape and forms. For those of you who maybe want to understand how this idea of mudéjar is being reshaped and re-understood in Europe, the book by Guise is quite thorough and perhaps a little dense, but it's very good to see how the political tendencies have changed from this perspective. And then, I wanted to give you a more generic book, Gillen and Joyce in that regards. Experiencing Architecture in the 19th Century will help you understand how all of those styles were mingling and also being treated separately. And finally, Green's Buildings and Landmarks of America will explain the specifics that apply to the American continent, but always with relationship to Europe. And well, I am just about to open the chat to answer your questions. So let me put the links in the chat one more time. And the chat should now be open. So please fire away for any questions that you may have, any thoughts, any ideas that will come through. And I'm just going to quickly have a sip of water. All right, so Jacob, this is actually a very good question, and we sort of touched upon it last week. So there is actually no difference between Gothic or Goth. In fact, Gothic receives that name because in the Renaissance, the way to essentially describe Gothic was by using the word Goth to refer that architectural and artistic style of the Middle Ages came from those Germanic barbarians, the Goths. And in a way, it used that word almost in a despective manner to suggest that Gothic was inferior and not as beautiful as what they were developing in Renaissance times. And well, Rodin's work is sort of Gothic, but it takes influence from many other things. So it does have Gothic elements, but I wouldn't consider it just Gothic in that regards. Thank you so much, Betty. It's my pleasure. Marina, can you put the list? Yes, of course. Sorry, I always go very fast on that last one because I don't know. I assume people by this moment in time don't care so much about reading. So my bad. So you have it here again. And no worries, the recording, again, those of you who may have come late to the lecture or who want to revisit this, because I appreciate there is a lot to cover and lots of buildings, you can rewatch it on YouTube and the YouTube channel for World Virtual Tours. And in general, in the World Virtual Tours section for the Academy, you have the different listings in there. So, make use of the recordings because, we don't have them for many other tours. So take them as much as you want. Kate, if the term neo-Moorish is not acceptable today, what term we should use? Just Islamic. It's Islamic art. It is Islamic because it is the exact same type of art and architecture that we see in the rest of the Islamic world. So why should we call it any different just because it's in Europe? We do call Christian art in China, I don't know, something else, if you see what I mean. We simply give it a different name because for a really long time, Europe, particularly Spain, but other countries as well, did not want to have that association with their Islamic and Arabic past. So this new word was created to refer to that thing that was other than the actual culture of the country. But it is Islamic art. It's just repackaged in a slightly different way. So that is what we should really be calling it, Islamic revival, or just simply Islamic art of the 19th, 18th, whatever century. That should be the acceptable, the inclusive, and the truthful way of referring to it. No worries, thank you so much. Isn't there yes, so there is a separate talk about Gothic, but Gothic from the Middle Ages. So today we've been looking at purely Neo-Gothic. All the examples of today were just revival Gothic. The one from last week is the Gothic of the Middle Ages, which is slightly different. No worries. Thank you so much, guys. I'm so glad that you love architecture and you are quite happy to, indulge me in this one because I really do love it. I think you probably see because I'm a big nerd about all of this stuff. But it's such a beautiful way to see how mankind can do things other than, causing pain and destruction to oneself. We have such a beautiful talent that we've developed over hundreds of years. It's worth exploring. Thank you so much, Patricia. Very kind. Lovely to have you here, Lama. Thank you so much, Adriana. It's very, very lovely to have you guys here one more time. I'm just gonna put the links for the donations and the upcoming tours in the chat again, and that will allow me to refresh because, Zoom always takes a moment or two to actually get things going. So I can see there are a couple of more questions. Let me get in there. I'm glad that you agree that the examples from India and Bosnia were interesting because, again, I think sometimes from a very Western perspective, we kind of forget the lengths of the world and how wide the world is and how much more interconnected everything is. And, architecture is a universal language. Doesn't matter where you are. It's very, very important. I'm glad that it's a useful clarification, E. No worries. It's my absolute pleasure. And Steve, one of my favorite parts of Gothic revival. Well, I wanted to bring some examples from Singapore, but honestly, I was running out of space, Steve. You'd be surprised how many slides I had to cut down today and last week because I was like, I don't have enough time. I can't add it all. But this is the thing. This is honestly just the top of the iceberg, guys, which is why I always encourage you to do some further reading and have a look for yourselves because, there is so much into it that we could be here forever. And the recording should be posted straight after this, E. So it may take an hour for the whole thing to buffer, but later on this evening, it should be fully accessible. No worries, Amy. Thank you so much for this. And yes, there will be the majority of my talks tend to come back after a while. So yes, it will be back available. Do not worry. It will be coming back. Thank you so much, Dominic, and everybody else for your lovely comments. It's a pleasure sharing this with you. It's, always so much fun. And well, Martin, yes, the thing is, the Netherlands overall and even Belgium have a very interesting aesthetic, even within original Gothic, because to some extent they were not necessarily isolated because they're very well connected, but in contact with so many countries like France, Germany, and the UK and Scandinavia. The art style is indeed neo-Gothic, but it has a lot of regional characteristics that diverge a little bit. So again, it was one of the many examples where I was like, I don't know if I can allow to put it, because although it's relevant, it perhaps is not as, iconic or easy to show the main, iconography aspects of it. But yes, there is a huge amount of beautiful neo-Gothic work by Coopers, which is definitely recommended. Again, a little bit different and with some other elements that are not just neo-Gothic, but definitely, worth the worth the time. And Lucia, thank you so much for your question. Yes, there are art critics, yes, that they are constantly explaining that the style of exactly 100%. And in fact, Romania was a country that I couldn't quite, again, I just didn't have enough time to include today. Romania at this moment in time is going through some very interesting changes as a country, and that shows through the art. So, although we do indeed call it uh, Byzantine, it's not truthful in the sense of Romanian art and architecture. You're absolutely right that although it does have a root in Orthodox art, there is a lot of revival for traditional things outside of that Byzantine influence, and there are actually some beautiful examples all across Romania, most of which I would say the best ones are not even in Bucharest, but in some of the, farther away isolated parts of the countryside, where yes, you can see examples of Byzantine, but it's so far-fetched from what we see in the rest of the areas that were affected by it, that again show how the revival style is not all encompassing and why we have so many different spikes of it all over. But that's, I would love to spend some time just doing, these little bits and pieces that are the regional styles. But in 45 minutes, I only have so much time. No worries. Thank you so much, guys. It's my absolute pleasure. I'm honestly so grateful that all of these sessions have been making sense. And like I said, do remember that we are not done. We have the Romanesque session next week, which will hopefully help make sense of a lot of things that we've seen today and why Gothic was preferable for some of the things that we've seen in comparison to that much more, I guess, brutalist type of architecture that we developed in the early stages of the Middle Ages. But Romanesque, in that sense, is going to be, well, a completely different beast. And once again, with many examples all across, not just, well, Europe, but not just the countries that you probably are imagining, because some of the best examples of Romanesque are going to come from all kinds of places. So don't miss the last part. For those of you that are looking to obtain the certificate, remember that after the 4 lessons are done, you will receive a questionnaire. It's relatively easy. It's kind of true and false or multiple choice. And that is all based on information that we've covered on the lessons. So if you need to go and rewatch them again, do make sure that you do so. But, otherwise, it should be pretty straightforward. And remember that next month, on Mondays again, we start a brand new academy with the Carolingians. So we will be exploring a lot more of the Middle Ages, but from a different perspective. And that is pretty much all we have time for today, guys. So no, thank you, guys. It's my absolute pleasure. Well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to be putting in there the links one last time. Thank you so much for all of your support. Thank you so much for promoting the Academy, for the donations, and for the love that you send us and all of the lovely emails that I've received so far. You're all so precious, and I'm just so glad to share this with you. And on that note, I hope that you have a lovely rest of your week. I'll be seeing you over on Monday. And if you're around, remember, Saturday at the same time, we will be seeing the beautiful medieval town of Salisbury and that wonderful Gothic